The California Dreaming podcast is brought to you by Blueberry. There is more to making a podcast than just talking into your mic and hitting publish. You're going to need a little bit more than that. And I'm talking about reliable hosting so your time can be spent working on your show. You want accurate download numbers, you want to see the audience that you're reaching, and you're going to want a web page that is simple and easy to work with. That's why I've chosen to use Blueberry. It's simple media hosting and fully integrated WordPress website. It can't get any easier, especially for someone like me who knows nothing. If you host a show or you're thinking about starting one, visit www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to give it a try for a month for free. Their dedicated support team will be right there to help you every step of the way. And with 1 month for free using our promo code DREAM, you've got no more excuses to start up that podcast that you keep talking about starting. There are a number of ways that you can support California Dreaming. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can spread the word about the show. You can recommend us in podcast and true crime fan groups. And you can leave the show a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you listen to the show on. And if you would like to go a little above and beyond, you can also support the show on our Patreon. You can gain access to at least one exclusive episode per month, and there are currently more than 50 episodes that you can binge. And we are in the middle of a series, so it is a pretty interesting case that many of you are familiar with, and I'm just giving you my own unique take on it. It's a good deal starting at just $1. In addition, there are about 8 premium episodes available for supporters at the $5 and above tiers. This week, I'd like to thank Christina W., Annie B., Brother Earl, Deborah M., Linda B., Jonna F., Kiki W., Diana C., Sharon, Cordelia F., Brenda S., Cynthia S., April G., and Heather for joining Patreon, and Aber K., Gabby, Ryan S., Jade B., Donna B., Joy N., Deborah F., Heather A., and Emily H. for raising your pledges to the next tier. And if a monthly subscription is just not your thing, you can help with a one-time donation to our show through our PayPal using our email, californiapod@gmail.com. Every little bit helps in keeping California Dreaming going and ad-free forever, so thank you. A quick note about episode 161. While most of the comments and feedback about the story of Eva and George hang, and it was one that you found sad and intriguing and thought-provoking, there was some issue in the manner in which I framed crime and violence and mental illness. And maybe I wasn't clear on what I was getting at when I was discussing the mass shooter and whether or not mental illness played a factor in what these young men ultimately did. Keep in mind that George Hang was not a troublemaker in school that we know of. Nobody ever spoke ill of him. There was no indication that he had any run-ins with the law. The only person who said there was anything troubling going on with the young man was his mother's friend, and it was something that she inferred from observations that she made and the limited conversations that she had with George's mother. The point that I was trying to get across in discussing the shootings that took place between 2012 and 2015 was to highlight the manner in which the media tends to portray some of these young men and what may or may not have been going on in their lives, starting from early on, in school, at home, amongst their friends, and whether or not there was a history of any mental, emotional, or psychological matters that had ever been previously addressed. Not necessarily whether or not they were under the care of a doctor at the time these men perpetrated their crimes. The media has this way of talking to people who may have known the shooter in the past or even in the present. They talk to classmates and teachers and neighbors and childhood friends or anybody that had ever interacted with the person. The media will talk to almost anybody, and really, I don't even know how much they actually do any fact-checking. They just want the material. I recently listened to an episode of Crime in Sports, and I don't know if any of you listened to that. It's hosted by James and Jimmy, a pair of comedians. And one of them was talking about a an event or a news thing or a crime that happened in their hometown, and the media was looking for people to talk to about the thing. And he just went up to a local journalist and claimed that he knew the person involved in the news story and just started talking so he could be on TV. But in reality, he didn't know the person at all, like at all. And that's kind of what I was getting at. And the reasons why I brought up the media reports and things like this is because that is what George's mom was watching. She was watching these reporters and whatnot talk about these shooters, and she's relating what she's going through to George to what's being said on TV. And it seemed like to me that she may have been buying into it, and therein lies the problem. It was not necessarily an issue of whether or not these mass shooters were or were not being treated, and even if they were, the treatment would have needed to have been effective. What I mean by all this is to say that what I brought up in that episode about my own aunt, who had been under the care of a mental health professional uninterrupted since 1985, yet she's had violent outbursts directed only at my mom. Not my daughter, not any of her siblings, never in public, never at me, just my mom. So, why is that? Well, if you know me and you know this show, then you know I've had my fair share of issues with my mom. But it is not only me. It's anyone in the family, including my daughter, and including my mentally ill aunt. While I can't say anything definitive about why my aunt lashes out only at my mom, I can speculate that it's probably because she's triggered by my mom. I can't get into specifics about what goes on between them behind closed doors, but based on what I've shared and what goes on between my mom and me, you can probably reach your own conclusions about the toxicity of it all. And the point is that there's a trigger. My aunt is medicated. She sees her doctor every 3 months, yet she has these outbursts aimed at only one person. I can't speak for everybody, but I'm sure nearly all of us have something that's triggering, whether a person is mentally ill or not, whether a person is being treated or not. I just don't think that there is one simple solution or a blueprint for human behavior. But back to the media, they're looking for a story. They're looking for motives. They're looking for reasons why. And one of the things they look to is whether or not there is a documented history of mental illness. The specific shooters I mentioned in episode 160, it is 160, I believe. Did I say 161 earlier? I think it's 160. Those events simply happened to fall in the timeline of that specific story involving George and what was being said about them in the media at the time. Not necessarily whether or not they were mentally ill and what the status of their mental illness was at the time of the shootings. I wanted us to have an understanding of what Eva and George Hang's lives were being inundated with on TV and in the news to put some context around it. This was not meant to turn into an analysis of mental illness and violence. Also, remember, the friend brought up the fact that Ava was concerned because George played violent video games, another issue that played out in the media and had been hotly debated for quite some time before all of this happened, going back to the Columbine High School shooters. What I was trying to get across was that I believed Ava's perceptions were being heavily influenced by the media. Any takeaway other than that was not where I was going with that discussion. Only the influence of the media when it comes to mental illness, video games, and violence. So my apologies for any misunderstandings. I'm not qualified to discuss mental illness on any level deeper than my personal experiences because I'm not a professional, and all the Googling in the world is not going to make me one. I'd also like to thank Jen for her personal professional input in helping me see this a little bit more clearly. All right, let's move on from that. Before we get into today's story, I think it might help us out a little bit if we take time to understand the self-defense laws in California, because this story isn't as cut and dry as it may seem on the surface. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that not everyone was particularly honest and forthcoming during the course of the investigation. But we'll get through all of that, and we can, in the end, decide how we feel about this event and how it played out. First off, California is not a stand your ground state. States that have enacted stand your ground legislation essentially have removed the requirement of a person to be compelled to retreat from a threat, if you can, before you decide that your only option is to use force or deadly force to defend yourself. In other words, if you can remove yourself from a potentially threatening situation, then you have to. It's called the duty to retreat. If you are unable to retreat, then and only then can you use deadly force to defend your life. As of right now, 21 out of the 50 states have stand your ground laws, Florida being the first state to enact that law back in 2005. Since then, Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, Montana, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and West Virginia have followed suit. According to findlaw.com, when it comes to self-defense laws in California, it says, the right to use force, even deadly force, to defend yourself is a broadly accepted principle of the criminal justice system. But while all states allow defendants to claim self-defense if they can back up such claims, and we know the defendant, if he or she is claiming self-defense, then they must take the stand to testify to that claim. Their defense attorney cannot speak to it on their behalf. States do differ on the scope of what may be considered appropriate use of force and when it may be applied. For instance, some states have what are referred to as the stand your ground laws, which, like I said, does away with a person's duty to retreat from imminent danger. In states with these types of laws, individuals have the affirmative right to use deadly force to defend themselves regardless of where they are or whether they had an opportunity to retreat. Then there's castle doctrine. We've talked about this in some previous episodes, and when it comes to standing your ground, we heard a lot about that when the killing of Trayvon Martin happened, but the two laws are compared and contrasted, and we learned about what it meant and how it varies from state to state. California, as I said, is not a stand your ground state, but it does recognize the castle doctrine, which is a statute that applies to you when you are in your home or your place of business or any other type of real property. It says that an individual using deadly force to protect his or her property has no duty to retreat, but castle doctrine is void once an individual is no longer on his or her property. When a jury is being instructed about self-defense, when that is being asserted by the defendant, they are told that they need to assess the claim and how to do so, with one of the most important aspects of the law being that right to use force in self-defense, or if he or she is defending another person, that right comes to an end as soon as the attacker withdraws or appears to no longer be able to inflict any type of injury. So that can be a very tricky area to pinpoint in some cases. On the law books in California, it says, in regards to rights of self-defense in mutual combat, or as the initial aggressor, a person who engages in mutual combat or who starts a fight has a right to self-defense only if, 1, he or she actually and in good faith tried to stop fighting, 2, he or she indicated by word or by conduct to his or her opponent in a way that a reasonable person would understand that he or she wanted to stop fighting and that he or she had stopped fighting. And 3, that he or she gave his or her opponent a chance to stop fighting. A person does not have the right to self-defense if he or she provokes a fight or a quarrel with the intent to create an excuse to use force. Our story today involves a fight. One person provoked it. One person said he acted in self-defense. Several persons lied about it. And one person died. In today's 162nd episode of California Dreaming, the tale of murder or self-defense. As I said in the opening, our story today is about a fight. It wasn't a bar fight. It happened outside of a bar. It was more of a street fight, technically. There was some drinking involved. There was some heightened emotions. You've got someone who might be particularly hot-headed. A fun evening is liable to take a turn for the worse pretty quickly. 25-year-old Dusty Harless was kind of a popular guy in the San Diego, California area back in 1996. He was originally born in Dewey, Montana, and I looked up Dewey, and while there is a photo montage of the area, there isn't even really a Wikipedia page and no census information. The census area Dewey is included in is in the county which it is located, and that's Beaverhead County. So I'm going to take a wild guess that Dewey, Montana is probably a lot of big skies and countryside. So Dusty moved to California. It seemed primarily at first to go to college, which he did. He attended Palomar Community College. Even though it's not a big university, when I looked up the school, most of their notable alumni are professional athletes. NFL players, baseball players, MMA fighters. It looks like there was at least one WWE wrestler. And Dusty himself was quite the athlete. He was an AAU National Wrestling Champion for his alma mater. And if you're like me and you're not savvy when it comes to collegiate sports, amateur sports, or sports in general, the AAU is the Amateur Athletic Union, which is one of the largest nonprofit volunteer multi-sport event organizations dedicated to the development of amateur sports. Anyway, Dusty was a wrestling champion, so keep that in mind as we go along here. Dusty was also described as a world-class wakeboarder, and after college, he went on to work as a wakeboard salesperson for a company called Innovative Manufacturing Ventures. Everything I read about Dusty indicated that he was a well-liked person, and he had more friends than he really knew what to do with. At the time that this story takes place, he was in a relationship with a woman named Sky Flanders, who was also 25 years old at the time. So the couple had gone out on the evening of April 17th, 1996. Now, in an article I read on this case and in the Forensic Files episode that covered this story too, both said that Dusty and Sky were out for an evening on the town on a Saturday night. But when I Googled the date, which I do for almost all of our stories, to find out the day of the week that these things happen on, April 17th, 1996 came up as a Wednesday night. So I'm thinking that perhaps whoever wrote the article and those writing for Forensic Files assumed that it was a Saturday, since everything that went down that night took place after midnight, which would take us into the early morning hours of Thursday morning. So it was sometime after midnight when Dusty and Sky decided to head home. When they walked outside, it was raining. And it was in this moment that Dusty and Sky would be separated for a few minutes. I'm not 100% clear on exactly what happened here, but what I got from how this was described, they were going to head over to an adjacent liquor store or a convenience store where Dusty would be able to flagged down a cab to give them a ride or use a phone to call a cab, at which point Sky kind of hurried up ahead of him, or she was some distance away from him to go stand under an awning in order to keep from getting drenched in the downpour. So that's the scene. It's dark, it's raining, it's late, and Dusty and Sky are seemingly far enough apart from each other that anyone passing by might think that either one of them is alone. That's exactly what another 25-year-old named David Gensler seemed to think when he happened to drive by. He noticed Sky alone, in the rain, under that awning, so he stopped. Now, depending on who you believe, either he offered Sky a ride, or he said something rude or vulgar to her, because, there will always be two sides of the story, perhaps even three. Obviously, David did not know or realize that Dusty was nearby. Otherwise, he likely would not have stopped. According to Sky, she said she told David that she was with someone or that she was with her boyfriend, something to that effect. Whatever happened next seemed to have happened very quickly because David either lingered or he was immediately noticed very fast by Dusty because Dusty apparently approached David's car. He was described as really angry or riled up that this guy had stopped to try and talk to his girlfriend. And the story of what happened next wildly differs depending on who's telling it. David Gensler said that Dusty came up alongside the passenger side of his car with the intentions of confronting him about talking to Sky. Things began to escalate from there, and eventually both men ended up on the outside of the vehicle, and a fight ensued, and Dusty ended up being stabbed in the chest, a wound that severed his aorta. He bled out and died within minutes. There are numerous versions of exactly how this fight went down, and I will try to go over them in as much detail as possible, but I do need to preface this. If you've seen the story on Forensic Files, the information is quite limited. Some of it is erroneous, some of it seems slanted in favor of Dusty Harless and strongly biased against David Gensler. And since the time the episode was produced and aired originally, a few more things have happened in the case. So we're going to go over the various versions of what those involved and witnessed said happened. And everyone's version is different. The night of Dusty's death, his girlfriend Sky was interviewed by police. She said that David had approached her while she was walking across the street, headed for that shelter from the rain, and he asked her if she wanted a ride. On the Forensic Files episode, what he said was described as being something along the cheesy lines of, "Hey baby, do you want a ride?" But he didn't notice that Dusty was across the street, so when Dusty noticed the car and the man inside talking to Sky, this apparently made Dusty really upset. Sky said Dusty first approached the passenger side of the car and knocked on the window and confronted David about talking to her. It's been reported that Dusty next went over to the driver's side of the car and that David got out of his vehicle. It's also been said that Dusty pulled David out of the car. Sky, on the morning of the killing, told police that David got out of his car and the men exchanged punches. At some point, the two men ended up tussling on the ground. Sky said in her initial interview with police that Dusty flipped David onto the ground using a wrestling move that would cause David to end up face down. David ended up being able to reach for a knife that he had in his pocket, and Dusty ended up stabbed almost in the middle of his chest, a wound that severed his aorta, which is a major artery, causing a fatal wound. Also during the initial interview, Sky told investigators about Dusty's skills as a wrestler, and she also mentioned that she knew that he had been involved in a number of street fights in the past. Not only did Skye tell police this version of her story the morning that Dusty died, but she also told the exact same version to about 20 different people, friends and acquaintances, in the days following his death, and she repeated the same story at a preliminary hearing. Now, Skye admittedly didn't see every single thing that happened between David and Dusty, but when Dusty was stabbed, Skye had no idea a knife had been used in the fight, and she didn't realize right away that Dusty was mortally wounded until David got back into his car and drove away. That is when she saw Dusty lying on the ground. But through all of the chaos, Skye was able to see the license plate of the car. And when she turned her attention back to Dusty, it was then that she saw the wound that he had suffered to the chest. Paramedics arrived at the scene within minutes, but there was nothing that could be done. Dusty was dead before they got there. Skye, in her interview on Forensic Files, described the man who stabbed Dusty as being crazed. She said he had a crazed look in his eye. Her story about what happened that night would change later on. As I had mentioned in the beginning, Dusty Harless was a very popular and well-liked young man in the San Diego area, so the news of his death spread pretty quickly and made headlines on the local news and in the newspapers. After all, the man he had been in a fight with was at large, so police were looking for him. Fortunately, Skye was able to provide the license plate information, and when police ran that number through the DMV records, it came back as belonging to a local woman named Barbara Gensler. When police arrived at her home, she said the car was hers, but the primary driver of the vehicle was her son David, and she did not know where he or the car was at. So, David Gensler's name and image was all over the local news, so it quickly became clear to David that he could not stay in hiding forever. This wasn't going to go away, so he went ahead and turned himself in a couple of days after Dusty's death. Now, David Gensler, he was a finance student at San Diego State University. He was kind of bookish looking, kind of tall and lanky, really thin. He had a thin face. He already had a receding hairline. He had these wire-rimmed glasses, kind of a little dorky looking. However, in the comment sections of one of the articles on this case, one commenter said that David Gensler was a black belt in some sort of martial arts, but I was not able to confirm that anywhere in any other articles or in the court documents related to this case. But by all appearances, he seems harmless. But, I mean, it's after midnight. He's trying to talk to Skye. He has a knife in his pocket. It's not exactly the best look for the guy. But really, he may very well have been doing the gentlemanly thing by offering her a ride. It was raining. He thought she was alone. I don't really like to judge what people are capable of based on their looks. There are several serial killers who look kind of nerdy, so I don't put anything past anyone, David Gensler included. But whatever his intentions were, all of that became null and void once Dusty rushed over to confront him. David did eventually turn himself in after he saw the news reports about Dusty's death. One report said that he turned himself in after about a day. Another report said that he turned himself in after 3 days. Either way, he did show up, but he was, for the most part, not very cooperative, and he came armed with an attorney, so what he was going to tell police was likely going to be filtered closely by his attorney, but in the end, he never officially provided police a statement. In addition to that, David refused to provide detectives with the location of the vehicle that he was driving the night of the fight. He refused to turn over the knife. He refused to turn over the bloody clothing. At least that's how everything was portrayed on the Forensic Files episode. But here's the thing. I don't really know how all of this is really supposed to go down for somebody who's in a position such as David Gensler had found himself in. It's not very often that someone who is wanted in connection with a death has the time to organize his evidence, has the time to contact an attorney, and turns himself in when he's ready to. Anyway, after David's arrest, the case was assigned to San Diego County Deputy District Attorney Peter Longenbach and investigator Jeffrey O'Brien. I don't always use the names of the people involved on the prosecution side, only when they play a bigger role in the ultimate outcome of a case. So those are a couple of names that are going to come up periodically as we go along here, so keep those in mind. As for the attorney that David hired, his name was Gerald Blank. And I'll bring this up now. Deputy DA Longenbach filed a motion during the pretrial portion of the case to have David's attorney recused, in other words, taken off the case, not to be allowed to represent David as his attorney of choice. And I'm bringing that up now because it has to do with the turning over of some key evidence. At a pretrial motion hearing held for the purposes of compelling the defense to produce the evidence to the prosecution, David's ex-girlfriend, a woman named Sherry Logal, she testified at this evidence hearing that she was doing so under immunity. She stated that she had given a box of bloody clothing and a knife to David's attorney, Gerald Blank, but Mr. Blank denied receiving the knife with the bloody clothing. It was then that Deputy DA Longenbach submitted a motion to remove Mr. Blank from representing David, and this motion to recuse was based on the fact that the ex-girlfriend, Sherry, she had admitted to the court that she lied about delivering the knife to Mr. Blank. Now, I'm not quite clear why she lied about it, though she did write a letter to David while she was in the jail that she was pressured by the prosecutor to lie about her communications with Mr. Blank. And it's not clear how it was that David's attorney came to be in possession of the knife and why all of this went down this way in court. Why did Sherry say she gave the knife when she didn't? And if she didn't, then how did the attorney get it? And really, in the end, what difference would it make how the knife came to be in his possession to begin with? Whether it was Sherry or David that gave it to him. I don't really know what the big deal is. Whatever the case, once it was known that she lied, it's going to be nearly impossible to ascertain how that all truly went down. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that they're obligated to turn those items over to the prosecution so they can have those things examined by their forensic people. One theory that I can think of is maybe they were trying to be overly cautious, or if they were trying to protect David Gensler as much as possible to make sure that he was going to fare well at trial. Or maybe they were trying to be shady. It's hard to say. But to me, David seems to be doing the opposite of everything we see wanted criminals do. He's doing what people are advised to do over and over again. He didn't talk to police. He got an attorney. He didn't destroy evidence. His actions on some level may seem like he's being uncooperative, but I tend to think that David was doing what he needed to do in order to protect himself because he knew that he was potentially going to be in a lot of trouble here. I mean, he stabbed a guy to death. That's pretty serious and pretty scary. So prior to turning himself in, and we can only speculate, but David's come to realize that the man he fought with has died, and he's wanted, and he's hiding. He's retained an attorney, he's held on to the evidence from that night, the shirt, the knife, and the car. They're going to go ahead and have David voluntarily turn himself in, but he's not going to show up with the evidence. I don't know when he gave his ex-girlfriend the items that she had, but she eventually turned them over to the attorney, but their stories conflicted at one of the pretrial hearings. She first said that she turned the knife over. The attorney said he didn't receive it. Sherry later said she lied about turning over the knife, but there doesn't seem to be any other explanation as to how the knife came into his possession. It had to have been either David or Sherry that had given it to his attorney, and none of these items were handed over voluntarily to the prosecution, which they're required to do. They had to be compelled by order of the court to do so. As for the car, that's another thing that David did that wasn't really a good look for him. He never revealed the location of the vehicle. It was found a week after the fight, parked clear across town in some neighborhood. It was towed by police, processed by their crime scene people, and in it they found Dusty's blood in various places where you'd think blood would be found, on the steering wheel, on the gear shift, on the blinker. So while that's important evidence here, obviously there's no question that the men fought in some capacity. Dusty was stabbed, David drove off, depositing the blood in his car. But him hiding the car, I don't think that was going to help his case very much at all. Anyway, the prosecution, as a result of this hoopla over the evidence, moved to have Mr. Blank removed as David's primary counsel because it was going to be his intentions to call both David's ex-girlfriend and the attorney to testify. And if Mr. Blank was going to be a witness, then, well, he can't be David's attorney anymore. And the judge granted the motion, and Mr. Blank was removed as David's attorney. Also, there was a letter that Sherry wrote to David while he was in jail, and in this letter, she told him that the investigator for the DA's office had pressured her into testifying falsely about her communications with David's attorney. So there we have the beginnings of some claims of shadiness on the part of the prosecution here on the case, and we will circle back to the implications of David's attorney's recusal a little bit later on in this story. Going back to the night of the fight, there was another witness named Scott Davis who happened upon the scene at some point, either just before the fight broke out, just as the fight had begun, or sometime during the fight, depending on which version of the story you believe. And the reason I can't say specifically when this witness showed up is because he's given several accounts of what he saw. In one story he gave, he said as he drove by, he saw Dusty and Sky walking hand in hand as they crossed the street, and it was then he witnessed David Gensler drive up and jump out of his car. In the Forensic Files episode, Scott's version was he was passing by in his car, and as he was going by the scene, he saw that two men were fighting. He pulled over, and according to him, he tried to break the fight up. He was a bouncer at a nearby bar. It was the bar that Dusty and Sky had just left shortly before the fight broke out, but that was a moonlighting job. His day job is a petty officer in the U.S. Navy. He claimed that he arrived just as the fight was beginning, and he saw David punch Dusty really hard in the face or someplace about the head, that Dusty fell onto his back, and that David got on top of Dusty, straddled him to hold him down. He pulled a knife from his pocket and stabbed Dusty one time in the chest. Then Scott said after David stabbed Dusty that he turned around and threatened him with the knife, at which point Scott retreated to his vehicle and fled the scene in fear for his life. This story also would change again, just as Sky's story would as well. Now, according to David Gensler, he's insisted all along that Dusty was the aggressor, that he escalated the fight by pulling him out of his car and then using a wrestling-type move, pinned him down, face down on the ground. He added that the witness who drove up and got out of his car, Scott Davis, he was not just a bystander, but rather he joined in the fight, taking Dusty's side. Somewhere in all of my research, I read that Scott Davis was actually acquainted with Dusty, perhaps friends with him, which is why he would take his side. I don't know if that's ever been confirmed. Sky may have said something to him that David was the aggressor, that he was the one who tried to talk to her or was rude to her, and Scott may have just taken her word for it and began to help defend her and Dusty. Either way, David contradicted Scott's statement that he stopped to help break up the fight. Rather, David said that Scott began kicking him over and over while Dusty continued to hold him down, pinned to the street. So finding himself outnumbered, Gensler, face down to the pavement, managed to retrieve a knife that he had been carrying in his front pocket and used it, he says, to defend himself. As he was face down, his back to Dusty Harless, he managed to reach back behind him over his shoulder and started to blindly try to stab Dusty in an attempt to get him off of him so he could retreat from the fight. Unfortunately for Dusty, Gensler did land one knife blow, and that single stab managed to slice through Dusty's aorta. And that is a wound that if someone is stabbed there and the aorta is punctured, a person will lose blood from that specific artery faster than just about any other place in the body because the pressure in the aorta is very high. And for somebody to be stabbed there, death is not rapid, but rather it takes the course of a few minutes. A person may survive this wound, but medical attention needs to be administered very quickly in order for that to happen. And it is very, very unlikely. You practically have to have your aorta cut or perforated in a hospital where you can be treated almost immediately. There is going to be a battle of the experts later on when it comes to Dusty's blood and where exactly it landed on Gensler as it began spurting from Dusty's chest, which I will get into. So, long story short, David Gensler was ultimately charged with second-degree murder. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. And there are a couple of reasons why that happened. And one of them was the fact that David had Dusty's blood on the front side of his shirt, which seemed to contradict his own testimony that he stabbed Dusty while he was face down on the ground. The prosecution surmised that if David was face down, then the blood should have ended up on the back of his shirt, not the front. In addition to that, Scott Davis had testified that David was the one on top and that he was the aggressor. But if you take a look at that scenario for what it was in the moment, what exactly would David Gensler's reason be for killing Dusty? Remember, he's been convicted of murder, so what's his reason for murdering Dusty if it weren't for self-defense? If he pulled up the sky, regardless of what he said or the manner in which he said it, would he willingly get out of his vehicle to fight an irate boyfriend? Sky had already told him to move along. There was nobody else around, so it wasn't like David was humiliated by Sky's rejection and he needed to redeem himself by fighting Dusty to save face or anything. David is kind of a dorky guy. He doesn't appear to be the type of person that goes around getting into street fights on a regular basis. But Dusty, he apparently had a reputation for doing that exact thing. He was kind of hot-tempered, and that was another thing that Sky kept to herself at trial. She did mention that to investigators the night that Dusty died. Of course, she was upset. She did not know the ramifications of what she was saying, but ultimately she ended up withholding that information when she testified at trial. There was also the publicity surrounding the case and the throngs of friends and supporters that Dusty had in the community. And David Gensler was portrayed in the media as being a cold-blooded murderer. According to an article that I read online, Dusty's mother had posted on a website for parents of murder victims to memorialize their children, which read, quote, "Dusty was on his way home with his girlfriend. Dusty was stabbed by David Gensler in cold blood. David jumped out of his car, hit Dusty in the temple, and Dusty fell to the pavement. David jumped on top of Dusty and stabbed him with a 4-inch knife, putting it all the way into the hilt." And in an obituary that Dusty's mom also paid for in her local newspaper in Montana, said that Dusty's killing was a tragic act of a demented individual. And even in the Forensic Files episode years later, Sky Flanders said that David had a crazed look in his eyes. But who's to say that that look in his eyes wasn't a look of fear? Because he was about to get into a street fight. It's likely he was pretty nervous about it when he saw Dusty coming. Anyway, David Gensler's conviction would not stand. In 2000, he appealed it, and it was overturned by the California Court of Appeal on the grounds that the judge at his trial had improperly recused his initial attorney, Gerald Blank. In addition to that, the Court of Appeal said that David's jury should have been instructed on an involuntary manslaughter conviction because there was sufficient evidence to support a finding of self-defense. David also made the allegation that there was prosecutorial misconduct in his first trial, but that wasn't going to be addressed at the time by the appellate court. David did go on to a second trial, and he was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in February of 2001. He was sentenced to 6 years the following month, and then he was released immediately on time served. So there were a number of things about trial number 2 that made the difference for David Gensler. Sky Flanders was a witness for the prosecution in both the first and second trials. According to the appeal documents on the day of the stabbing, Sky related to police that David had approached her while he was in his car as she was walking across the street and asked her if she needed a ride. She said when that happened that she saw Dusty across the street zipping up his jacket when she had glanced over at him when David began talking to her. Dusty noticed David in his car talking to Sky, so he crossed the street and knocked on David's car window. As Sky had detailed for the police on that day, she said that David got out of his car and the two men threw punches. Dusty then flipped David onto the ground, and David next stabbed Dusty while Dusty was holding David down. She explained the word flipped by clarifying that Dusty was a nationally recognized championship wrestler. In addition to that, this was not the first time he had been involved in a street fight. So this interview with Sky was videotaped and audiotaped, and she also testified at a pre-trial hearing where she told the same version of events in which Dusty was on top of David to as many as 20 other people as she was sharing what had happened that night to their friends and family. Then there came a time after that initial interview that same day that Dusty died that Sky had a meeting with Deputy District Attorney Longenbach and Investigator O'Brien. Remember, I told you to keep those two names in mind. She met with O'Brien once a little more than a week after Dusty's death, and then met with both of them together on April 29th, 1996. The timing and context of this meeting is going to play a very important role later on. It was at this meeting that Sky Flanders' story changed. At a preliminary hearing for the first trial that occurred on May 23, 1996, and subsequently at both the first and second trials, Sky claimed that she had little memory of the actual fight itself, because according to her, she was distracted by Scott Davis, the bouncer who was driving past the scene. When he stopped and got out, as Sky described, it was to break up the fight. He was the bouncer at the bar that Dusty and Sky had just left minutes earlier. She also described thinking that she saw Scott pulling David off of Dusty following the stabbing, which directly contradicts what both of them had testified to. During trial number 2, Sky admitted under oath that she had quote-unquote answered evasively in the first trial about whether or not Dusty had ever been involved in past fights. She also said this on camera on forensic files. She explained this evasiveness as her attempting to make it seem as though she only had knowledge of Dusty's time as a wrestler in college during sanctioned matches, but no knowledge of any fights that he may have been involved in when it came to street fights or bar fights. She also said in the second trial that she was pressured by both Longenbach and O'Brien to say nothing at trial about Dusty's past incidents involving street fights. So essentially, Sky Flanders is placing the responsibility of her perjuring herself onto the prosecutor and his investigator, that they wanted her to omit certain details in order to strengthen the case that they were trying to make against David Gensler for second-degree murder. So dreamers, when it comes to Sky Flanders, I'm not a big fan of hers. But I will say this. She was young. She suffered the loss of somebody that she loved in a very tragic way. Someone who was apparently attempting to defend her honor, which, to be honest, I think Dusty kind of overreacted a little bit. And honestly, we don't know for sure how rude or inappropriate David Gensler was being or not, but really, all Dusty needed to do was make his presence known, and most likely David would have simply driven off. No harm, no foul. Everybody makes it home, alive and in one piece. And for Sky, I'm sure it was probably the worst moment of her life, seeing Dusty fatally wounded, bleeding out on the street. She's sad, she's scared, she's devastated, and she's gonna be angry. She said David Gensler was crazed. And so she goes into the initial interview doing what comes naturally to most of us, just explaining what was seen and what she knew. It might have been her most honest moments in this whole entire ordeal. But she did say things that were not going to bode well for the prosecution if it was their goal to nail David Gensler for second-degree murder. For some reason, they wanted that conviction against him. And why the argument for self-defense was so out of the question, I don't know. That's one thing I don't understand about the prosecution of David Gensler. Sky had basically explained what happened the night that it happened, but the investigators and the prosecutor did not want that to be the way that this story played out. They wanted to pin a murder charge on David, and in order to do that, they needed some of Sky's statements from that night to go away. Another thing that came out at the second trial was the fact that Dusty's toxicology report showed that he had a blood alcohol content of 0.12 and that he had marijuana in his system, so he was legally intoxicated. That's not to say by any means that he deserved to be stabbed to death, but that fact, him being intoxicated, it could have affected his judgment. It could have impacted the manner in which he handled seeing David trying to talk to Sky, which could have explained the overreacting, and it could have also impacted the way the jury saw this case the first time. But anyway, what I was saying about Sky, on top of everything else, she may have been somewhat intimidated by the investigator and the prosecutor. She also wanted to do whatever she could to help get David Gensler convicted on the most serious charges, and that would require her to listen to what they were telling her to do when it came to what she should say and shouldn't say when she testified. But I can't put it past the average, reasonable person to know that the truth is the best and only thing to make sure an appeal isn't granted, an overturning of the conviction doesn't happen. Telling the truth to the best of her knowledge, to the best of her ability, no matter what the prosecutor or the investigator say. When you lie, you've really got everything to lose, not just the case, but also your own possibility of being charged with perjury. So I can't understand why Sky would want to jeopardize the case against David if she wanted him to be convicted. Or maybe she wanted him to be in jail for the rest of his life, which is essentially what he got the first time around, 20 to life. When the guilty verdict was read, Sky Flanders clutched both of her fists. She threw her head back, stared up to the ceiling in celebration of the second-degree murder conviction. Which, having the knowledge that we know she lied in order for the jury to reach that decision, is the biggest reason why I don't like her. To me, the conviction is justice for the victims and their loved ones. It's not a time for pumping your fist and smiling ear to ear in exhilaration, and I just didn't like the whole scene. Scott Davis, like Sky, testified at the preliminary hearing as well as both trials, and over time his story changed too. The day after Dusty's death, he gave an interview with police, where he said he saw David jump out of his car and chase after Dusty and Sky as they were walking away, attempting to get away from David, and they were holding hands. Clearly, this account of what happened is decidedly at odds with the account that Sky provided to police the same day as the homicide, almost in every aspect. Remember, she told police that the fight had already been going on when Scott Davis arrived at the scene, and he began taking part. Scott said he was trying to break up the fight. David Gensler said Scott began kicking him in the head as Dusty continued to hold him face down. Again, it's another situation where I can't quite understand why Scott Davis would tell a story that deviated so much from what both Sky and David had said. I don't know if he had anything to drink. I'd like to think not, since he was the door person at the bar that night. But if he was, perhaps his memory was a little muddled. Maybe he did see Dusty and Sky walking away from the bar holding hands, and he got that scenario mixed up with what actually went down at the fight. Perhaps it wasn't even drinking, but rather just the excitement, the commotion of the fight. He got jumbled up all in his recall of what happened. One of the things that makes any kind of sense to me is, again, the idea that he may have been friends with Dusty and Sky, and perhaps he thought by painting David Gensler as the aggressor in the fight that would help Dusty get justice. But no matter what people who loved and cared about Dusty may have thought or known about him and his reputation for picking fights for relatively minor slights, it didn't matter, because obviously they're going to be angry with David for winning that fight, for bringing a knife to a fist fight. They're going to want him to pay for Dusty's life with his own. Even if David was in the right to defend himself, they didn't care. They wanted to stand up for Dusty and make sure that David was convicted of the most serious charge of second-degree murder. And the only way to ensure that is to paint Dusty as the unwitting victim of an overly aggressive motorist who had just been rejected and spurned and humiliated by Sky Flanders. As I said, Scott Davis told investigators the day after Dusty's death his account of seeing a couple walking away hand in hand when David Gensler pulled up. However, Scott met with investigator O'Brien 7 days later on April 25th, and his story changed. In a report that summarized this meeting, investigator O'Brien wrote, quote, "Upon reflection, Scott Davis considered that he had not seen the couple walking away hand in hand," unquote. And then, at a May 23rd preliminary hearing, Scott testified that Sky and Dusty were standing several feet apart when the fight began. So now Scott's story is pretty much lined up with Sky's story, which is what the prosecution needed in this case to happen. They couldn't have conflicting stories from the two witnesses that were going to testify on Dusty's behalf. Again, this was a chaotic scene, and it is not uncommon for eyewitnesses to give varying accounts. Eyewitnesses can be unreliable, and it is not necessarily because they're doing it on purpose or trying to be deceitful. It's a very stressful and emotional event to think back upon, and details can be mixed up. This may or may not have been the case with Scott Davis, but it can't be overlooked how his story not only changed drastically, but changed to match Sky's. And this massaging of Scott's memories is not a good look for the investigators or the prosecutors. Coupled with the pressure that they put on Sky to omit important details in her testimony, it's starting to smell a little misconducty around here. Once David got out of prison for the time served, he was released on February 14, 2001. Obviously, he had a strong case for a civil lawsuit for prosecutorial misconduct both before and during his first criminal trial, the one in which he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. Can you imagine if this was truly a fight brought about by Dusty Harless's losing his temper when he saw David purportedly offering Sky a ride? Can you imagine having to possibly spend the rest of your life in prison for that? Longenbach and O'Brien, who were the defendants named in David's lawsuit, attempted to have the case against them summarily dismissed, citing official immunity. And the court did in fact grant the motion for a dismissal, except for the following allegations as written in David's complaint. It said, Longenbach and O'Brien suborned, or in other words, instigated perjury. Specifically, prior to the preliminary hearing and during the initial investigation of the incident, Longenbach and O'Brien met with Skye Flanders and told her in order to secure a conviction, she needed to lie about what she saw on the night of the incident and about Dusty Harless's violent past. It said that Longenbach and O'Brien were engaged in an investigative activity when they convinced Skye to change her version of the events that she witnessed. And that's going to be important, that the prosecutor, having been engaged in an investigative type activity, that's going to come up in the court's ruling. So the court took into consideration not just the fact that they were tampering with a witness, but they were also doing so while they were working on an active investigation. And so it was decided that David Gensler had enough evidence to bring about a valid and genuine argument that Longenbach and O'Brien had in fact pressured Skye Flanders to lie as a part of their initial investigation into Dusty's death. So the court did not dismiss this portion of David's complaint against them. Longenbach and O'Brien, their supervisors had motioned for a summary dismissal based on absolute and qualified immunity, but that was denied. When it came to the recusal of David Gensler's initial attorney, Gerald Blank, as a result of the contradictory statements given by David's ex-girlfriend about whether or not she turned the knife over to him, as a result of that, Longenbach and O'Brien successfully had him removed as David's attorney. Longenbach had already granted the ex-girlfriend immunity for her untruthful testimony, and Longenbach's bosses were aware of and condoned his strategy of having David's attorney recused from the case. All of that was found to be a strategy to weaken David's defense. The supervisory defendant's motion to dismiss was denied in the ruling on David's lawsuit. According to the ruling on Gensler's case, a prosecutor is protected by absolute immunity from liability for damages when performing the traditional functions of an advocate, in other words, his job as an attorney. However, the actions of a prosecutor are not absolutely immune merely because they are performed by a prosecutor. Prosecutorial immunity depends on the nature of the function performed, not the identity of the actor who performed it. Prosecutors are entitled to qualified immunity rather than absolute immunity when they perform administrative functions or investigative functions normally performed by a detective or a police officer. In cases such as these, the Supreme Court has consistently emphasized that the official seeking absolute immunity bears the burden of showing that such immunity is justified for the function in question. Furthermore, the presumption is that qualified rather than absolute immunity is sufficient to protect government officials in the exercise of their duties. Also noted is the Supreme Court has been quite sparing in its recognition of absolute immunity and has refused to extend it any further than its justification would warrant. To qualify as advocacy, an act must be intimately associated with the judicial phase of the criminal process, and prosecutorial immunity protects the prosecutor's actions that are closely associated with that process. And this close association with the judicial process is sometimes referred to as quasi-judicial conduct. In deciding whether to allow a prosecutor immunity from civil suit damages, a court must determine whether a prosecutor has performed a quasi-judicial function. If the action was a part of the judicial process, then the prosecutor is entitled to the protection of absolute immunity, whether or not he or she violated the civil plaintiff's constitutional rights. In other words, dreamers, the court ruling is saying here, a prosecutor can be immune to civil liability if he or she was doing their job or some activity that was job adjacent. However, the court acknowledged that when you use absolute immunity, then you're leaving a genuinely wronged criminal defendant, such as David Gensler is making the argument for in his first trial, without a chance to be vindicated in a civil suit against a prosecutor whose malicious or dishonest actions deprived him of his civil rights and liberty. However, the idea of absolute immunity for prosecutors is justified because not having this in place may be a disservice to the public interest as a whole. It protects the prosecutor's abilities to exercise independent judgment and to advocate vigorously without the threat of retaliation. So the concept behind prosecutorial immunity is to make sure that prosecutors do their jobs to the best of their ability. So if they had the fear of being sued at every turn, they might not be as effective in their work. Therefore, by and large, a prosecutor does have the advantage of absolute immunity from any lawsuit alleging that he or she maliciously initiated a prosecution, used perjured testimony at trial, or suppressed material evidence at trial. And he or she is also absolutely immune for direct participation in a probable cause hearing, as well as preparing and filing of charging documents. But the limits of prosecutorial absolute immunity have been explored by the courts. A court ruling had previously denied absolute immunity to prosecutors who had fabricated evidence during the early stages of the investigation when police officers and assistant prosecutors were performing essentially the same investigatory functions. The court has also denied absolute immunity to prosecutors accused of holding a defamatory press conference, which is an activity that had no functional tie to the judicial process. There have been other cases where the court has ruled that a prosecutor does not have absolute immunity for providing legal advice to police when it comes to whether or not probable cause existed to arrest a suspect, as well as for personally attesting to the truth of evidence in support of charging documents. The court acknowledged that whether the prosecutor is acting as an advocate or doing police-type work is complicated by the fact that, at least at the time, that may have changed since this ruling, the fact that the Supreme Court has not drawn a line between the two actions. It's been suggested in some rulings that the prosecutor may have absolute immunity once there is probable cause for an arrest or that an arrest has been made. If that's the case, then that is when the prosecutor takes on the advocacy role and will have absolute immunity. But this notion has also been rejected, explaining that a determination of probable cause does not guarantee a prosecutor absolute immunity for liability for all of the actions taken afterwards. And even after that, a prosecutor may be involved in police investigative work that may only be entitled to qualified immunity. The idea that prosecutors are only entitled to qualified immunity when they are engaged in an investigation has also been rejected by the court in previous rulings. That evaluating evidence and interviewing witnesses in preparation for trial is, in fact, advocacy, which is true despite the fact that some of these activities may be in preparation for trial, such as interviewing witnesses. These things may also be investigatory in nature rather than advocacy. The question is whether a prosecutor's investigation is the type that is normally done by police, in which case prosecutors are only afforded qualified immunity, not absolute immunity, or whether an investigation is bound up with the judicial process, thus giving the prosecutor the additional protection of absolute immunity. With this in mind, the court considered David Gensler's allegations against Longenbach and O'Brien. In David's claim against them, the portion that the court did not dismiss, it said that prior to the preliminary hearing and during the initial investigation into Dusty's death, the two of them met with Sky Flanders and told her that in order to secure a conviction, she needed to lie about what she saw on the night of the killing, as well as her knowledge of Dusty's violent past. The court understood this to mean, as a part of the initial investigation, Longenbach and O'Brien coerced or encouraged Sky Flanders to lie. Witness interviews may either serve an investigative or an advocacy-related function, as may other methods of gathering or manufacturing evidence prior to trial. Holding that pretrial evidence gathering is intimately associated with the judicial process and was protected by absolute immunity, while whether Lagenbach and O'Brien were engaged in an advocacy-related function intimately associated with the judicial phase of the criminal process when they met with Sky Flanders, or whether they were engaged in a police-type investigative work. If the former, then they are absolutely immune. If the latter, then they are entitled only to qualified immunity. If not done in a quasi-judicial capacity, the acquisition or manufacturing of evidence is not protected by absolute immunity. Acquiring known false statements from a witness for use in a prosecution is fabrication of evidence, and that is unprotected by absolute immunity. In a previous court case that was cited in David Gensler's civil ruling, it was said that a prosecutor had not met his burden to show that he was entitled to absolute immunity for acts of intimidating and coercing witnesses into changing their testimony before a grand jury. The court held that such activity constituted a misuse of investigative techniques legitimately directed at exploring whether witness testimony is truthful and complete and whether the government has acquired all incriminating evidence. It therefore relates to a typical police function, which is the collection of information to be used in a prosecution. Prosecutors are, however, absolutely immune for gathering additional evidence after probable cause is established or criminal proceedings have begun when they are performing a quasi-judicial function. There is a difference between the advocate's role in evaluating evidence and interviewing witnesses as he or she prepares for trial on the one hand, and the detective's role in searching for clues and corroboration that might give him probable cause to recommend that a suspect be arrested on the other hand. When a prosecutor performs investigative functions normally performed by a police officer, it is neither appropriate nor justifiable for the same act that absolute immunity should protect one and not the other. So dreamers, in other words, it depends on how and when this coercion or intimidation took place when the prosecutor, along with the investigator, spoke to Sky Flanders in the capacity in which the prosecutor was working, whether he was doing his attorney job or whether he was doing the job normally done by police, if he is going to be considered absolutely immune from the civil charges that David Gensler has brought alleging misconduct on his part. Lagenbacher and O'Brien are relying on the timing of their meetings with Sky Flanders to argue that they are entitled to absolute immunity. They point out that their meetings with Flanders occurred after David Gensler's arrest on April 19th, which David concedes was based on probable cause. However, as noted above in previous court rulings on the matter, a determination of probable cause does not guarantee a prosecutor absolute immunity from liability for all actions taken afterwards. Even after that determination, a prosecutor may engage in what is considered police investigative work that is entitled only to qualified immunity, not absolute. While interviews conducted before probable cause to arrest have been established are not protected by absolute immunity, the converse is not necessarily true. As the district court correctly observed, the courts have only drawn the line in the reverse, stating that absolute immunity cannot be invoked before probable cause was established. It has been held by the court in previous rulings that prosecutors who, soon after the arrest of a suspect, directed police to coerce a confession from a suspect are not entitled to absolute immunity because their activity was more police-like rather than prosecutorial. So the timing is relevant, but isn't necessarily the determining factor. It also has to be considered whether the meetings were more in the nature of a quasi-judicial advocacy type or a police-type investigative work. So because Deputy DA Lagenbach and Investigator O'Brien were engaged in slightly different functions, the court analyzed separately their entitlements to absolute immunity in David Gensler's case. Viewing the facts in the light most favorable to David, The court concluded that Investigator O'Brien was engaged in police-type investigative work, not quasi-judicial advocacy, when he met with Sky Flanders prior to David's bail hearing on April 29, 1996. O'Brien's report indicated that he met with Flanders several days prior to April 29th. In her testimony during the hearing on David Gensler's 2000 motion to dismiss, Sky Flanders estimated that this meeting took place about a week before the April 29th joint meeting with both Deputy DA Longenbach and Investigator O'Brien. She remembered that she and O'Brien talked for about an hour, primarily as to the identity of the person who stabbed Dusty Harless. Police investigations were still ongoing. At this time, the preliminary hearing at which the judge would decide whether there was probable cause to hold David Gensler over for trial in Superior Court was still a month away. Moreover, it is a supportable conclusion from the evidence that O'Brien's meeting with Sky Flanders took place before the criminal complaint was filed in municipal court on April 23, 1996, and before police finished their investigation and written synthesis, which is dated April 24, 1996. This written police synthesis leaves out the initial statement by Sky Flanders to police that Dusty Harless was on top of David Gensler at one point during the fight. It emphasizes David's point of view, but it does not include Scott Davis's story that Sky and Dusty were walking hand in hand. If all factual inferences are resolved in favor of David Gensler, one could conclude that O'Brien used his interview to change Sky Flanders' story about what she remembered to make her story more consistent with Scott Davis's story. Furthermore, the record reflects that during this period, O'Brien was engaged in other work that can only be characterized as police-type investigation. For example, he and Deputy DA Longenbach interviewed Scott Davis on April 25, 1996. The notes from the conversation reflect only a narrative from Davis's point of view about the events of the stabbing. O'Brien joined Police Detective Warwick in a meeting on June 3, 1996 with Sherry Logel, David Gensler's ex-girlfriend, discussing her story about giving David's knife to his attorney Gerald Blank, as well as David's overall character as a person. This conversation, too, was police-type investigative work, as indicated by the nature of the information obtained by the presence of Detective Warwick. On June 5, 1996, O'Brien interviewed Paul Ernst, another witness to the homicide, about what he had seen. Similarly, on June 28, 1996, O'Brien met with John Belsan, who came forward with evidence about a past fight he had had with David Gensler. Again, O'Brien's notes from this conversation reflect only John Belsan's narrative about what happened in that confrontation. Since O'Brien was engaged in police-type investigative work during the time he met with Sky Flanders, this supports an inference that he was also engaged in such work when he met with her. So, the court concluded from the foregoing that there was sufficient evidence in the record to support the conclusion that during this first meeting with Flanders, O'Brien was engaged in the process of acquiring or manufacturing evidence during a performance of police-type investigative work rather than engaged in quasi-judicial advocacy. At this stage of the proceedings, O'Brien is therefore unprotected by absolute immunity. And absolute immunity does not protect Longenbach if he was directing this police-type investigative activity by O'Brien, as in a previous ruling it was stated, when a prosecutor who assists, directs, or otherwise participates in obtaining evidence prior to an indictment undoubtedly is functioning more in his investigative capacity than in his quasi-judicial capacities of deciding which suits to bring and conducting them in court. There is sufficient evidence in the record to support the conclusion that Longenbach was actively directing O'Brien throughout his work on the Gensler case, including O'Brien's first meeting with Sky Flanders. For example, she testified that Longenbach would give her instructions that O'Brien would then reiterate. David Gensler also introduced a declaration from another deputy DA that stated, quote, "Jeff O'Brien does whatever Mr. Longenbach tells him to do." Because the evidence could support a conclusion that Longenbach was actively directing police-type investigative actions by O'Brien, and Longenbach is also not entitled to a judgment of absolute immunity for his actions taken with respect to O'Brien's meeting with Sky Flanders before April 29th. And I know all of this is sounding really tedious, but it's just important to understand how this happened and why this is happening. And the court documents, it goes into this long discussion again about timing, so I'm going to skip over all of that at this point. It's pretty long-winded. The documents said that there was evidence that Longenbach and O'Brien were reviewing and evaluating evidence at the April 29th meeting in preparation for the preliminary hearing and trial testimony, and this includes some testimony by Sky Flanders describing the meeting at some of the later proceedings in David Gensler's case. However, when we resolve all ambiguity in favor of David Gensler and viewing the evidence in the context of all other evidence about ongoing investigations, we conclude that evidence in the record supports the conclusion that Longenbach and O'Brien were engaged in police-type investigative work during that meeting. One of those pieces of evidence were the notes that were taken by O'Brien, which he captioned, quote-unquote, witness interview. These notes recorded only a narrative of what Sky Flanders reportedly said at the meeting about the events of April 17th and 18th. That's the night that Dusty was stabbed. The notes stated that Sky Flanders had told him during a conversation that took place at her residence several days earlier that she had a clearer picture in her mind of the events surrounding Dusty Harless's death. She stated that she felt like she could relate them in a more organized fashion than she may have done earlier in the investigation. The notes stated that Sky Flanders was distracted by the arrival of Scott Davis, which is inconsistent with the initial statement that she made to police. Thus, the notes reflect that Longenbach and O'Brien were in the process of gathering information from her during the meeting and possibly encouraged her to lie as a part of their process. In a previous court ruling cited by the court in David Gensler's suit, it was held that a declaration by a witness who was allegedly coerced and intimidated into lying eliminated any ambiguity about whether the prosecutor was engaged in an investigatory or a quasi-judicial function when he interviewed that witness. The declaration clearly showed that when the prosecutor met with the witness, he did so to tell the witness how she should testify. Here, by contrast, the interview notes show a process of police investigation, or viewed in a light most favorable to David Gensler, a process of manufacturing evidence while performing police-type investigative work, not Longenbach or O'Brien acting as advocates by actively preparing Flanders for her testimony in court. We therefore agree with the district court that Longenbach and O'Brien are not entitled to summary judgment, that they are absolutely immune for the actions during the April 29th meeting with Sky Flanders. In conclusion, the prosecutor in David's case, as well as the investigator, were denied absolute immunity, and David Gensler was able to prove that there was prosecutorial misconduct, that they purposely attempted to hide exculpatory evidence, that they tampered with evidence and or witnesses, and they encouraged perjury in order to win the second-degree murder conviction in David's first trial. A settlement was reached, though the amount of that settlement was not disclosed. Now, when it comes to David Gensler's second trial, I think the prosecutorial misconduct should have been addressed beforehand. Remember, I said that they didn't look at it when overturning his conviction, and they moved forward with trial number 2, and he was ultimately convicted of involuntary manslaughter. I think they should have looked at the prosecutorial misconduct at that time, made that ruling, and I believe that the whole case should have been thrown out completely because of all of the lying and the deceitfulness going on, not just with the witnesses, but with the prosecutor and the investigator. But that's not what happened. He ended up being convicted, but was released on time served. But that doesn't take away from the fact that he stands convicted. So, going back to why David Gensler's second trial had a different outcome, aside from Sky admitting that she lied or withheld information, at the very least she was encouraged or pressured to do so, as well as the information that came to light about Dusty's past involvement in street fights, There had been a big question as to who, in fact, was the aggressor in the fight, and whether or not David was truthful about being held face down on the pavement. You see, if you recall, and I don't even know if I brought it up, but there was a bloody t-shirt turned over to the prosecution as a part of the discovery. The t-shirt that he was wearing, that he turned over to police, it had blood splatter on the front of it, which would most likely mean, or one could infer, that the men were face to face when the fight happened. Not only would this have diminished the potential advantage Dusty had in the fight by having David held face down, but it also meant that it was possible that David was the man on top, getting the best of Dusty, getting the upper hand when he pulled out a knife and plunged it into Dusty's chest. The way California self-defense laws are written, if David was gaining an advantage in the fight, then he was bound by law to retreat if possible. There is no stand your ground law in California. If there had been, it is likely that David would have been found not guilty if he had even been taken to trial at all. If he had the advantage in the fight, pulling out a weapon to use deadly force was illegal. If David had been the one to start the fight and kill Dusty, then the second-degree murder charge may have been the more appropriate one. So the blood being on the front of David's shirt appears to contradict his testimony that he was face down on the ground. He said that he was being held down, that he managed to reach into his pocket, he pulled out a knife, and blindly reached back over his shoulder and happened to stab Dusty where his aorta was cut, causing him to begin the process of bleeding out. If you recall from what I said earlier about the blood flowing through the aorta, if blood is going to leave your body as fast as it possibly can, the fastest place it will spurt from is from a cut to the aorta, as it is under a great deal of pressure, and it spurts in rhythm with one's heartbeat. Therefore, it will spurt with a cadence. In the second trial, David's defense team presented an animated depiction of what they said would explain how the blood wound up on the front of his t-shirt instead of on the back, assuming that he was face down and stabbed Dusty by reaching back behind himself over his shoulder. This animation showed that in the moment that Dusty was stabbed, his strong hold on David was suddenly released, at which point David quickly turned over, coming face to face with the now mortally wounded Dusty. And in that split second, in sync with Dusty's still beating heart, the first spurts of blood landed on the front side of David's shirt, not on the back. And according to David, he scrambled to get up, he got back in his car and drove away. I believe Scott Davis actively participated in the fight after he got out of his car and joined in to help Dusty to attack David. Once he saw David with a knife and he saw the seriousness of what happened, this tough guy, the bouncer, the Navy petty officer, he ran away instead of staying behind to help Dusty and Sky. He then followed that up with lying to police a number of times, including telling him that he fled the scene because David Gensler threatened his life too. A story that I think he likely concocted in order to diminish how much he now looked like a coward. The kind of coward who would say, kick a man in the head while someone else is holding the guy face down, perhaps. I don't know if that's what happened. That is just what David Gensler said happened. And honestly, dreamers, he's the only one who seemed to have been the most truthful out of everyone involved in this. We know that Sky lied. We know that Scott lied. We know that the prosecutor and the investigator encouraged the lying. They all lied under oath, yet nobody was ever held criminally responsible, although the prosecutor and investigator had been held civilly responsible. The fact of the matter is, we're never going to really know for sure what exactly happened that night because the truth had been so mucked up at this point. David's actions in the days following the stabbing, don't exactly make the case for the guy being above board. But, if we try to put ourselves in his place, we can ask ourselves, what would we do? We're driving along one night. You see a young woman standing out in the rain alone. You stop and ask her if she needs a ride. And in this day and age, and even back then because there were taxi cabs, just not Uber or Lyft yet, it probably wasn't the brightest idea that David ever had in his life. Obviously, things went bad very quickly. Perhaps he genuinely thought he would be a gentleman and ask. Sky never said outright that he was rude or said anything appropriate, though some reporters seem to allude that it may have been like that. Like whatever he said fell somewhere between, do you need a ride? Or, hey baby, do you need a ride? It's funny how 2 words can change everything about the context of a thing. And I was just having this conversation with my daughter the other day. My mom called me to complain about my daughter's attitude. I know, that's ironic, right? But my daughter, she is choosing to live there, which my mom kind of needs. My mom bought her a new car, so there's some obligation that goes along with that. She lives there for free. We get it. My mom is old and she's annoying and she's not the nicest person in the world. And sometimes she wants a ride to do the most mundane things. So you just gotta get her out of the way so you can go on with your day. So my mom told Evelyn this particular day that she needed a ride to the bank. My daughter, she's 21. She's waking up at noon. So my mom's been sitting around all morning to spring this on her. And my mom says to her, I need a ride to the bank. So my kid, with a big old attitude, loud sighs, eye rolling, exasperation, all the body language, clenched teeth, she says, for what? Okay, I get it. I know my mom better than anyone. I know this isn't the first thing that you want to hear when you wake up, but like I said, just get my mom out of the way and carry on. So this made my mom upset, and she's like, forget it. I don't need a ride, whatever. It turned into this argument. So I called Evelyn and I told her, look, I know, I understand, but I do not want to get these calls from your grandma complaining about you. She started to defend herself and I was like, okay, full stop. You live there for free. You got a free car. She pays for your insurance. She takes care of everything. I know it feels like you practically have to sell your soul to live there, but this is your choice. Stop the attitude. Stop the body language. Stop the exasperated sighs and everything else attitude-y that you do, and just add 2 words in front of your statement. Your grandma asks you for a ride to the bank. While it's none of your business what she wants to go there for, just add these 2 words before you start talking. Tell your grandma, sounds good. For what? There. Problem solved. The whole dynamic of your statement has shifted. Don't be having your grandma call me to complain about you. We are in this pandemic. Your grandma has nobody around. Nobody likes her. The only people who are nice to her are the cashiers, her mechanic, her doctor, and bank employees. They're paid to be nice to her. Just get her out of the house, let her go visit with her money, then take her home, and you're done. Anyway, we don't know exactly what David said, but does it really make a difference if he was being a nice guy wanting to help, or if he was being a cheesy jerk with these crappy pickup lines? Because she did tell him that she was with someone else. I don't believe David became so enraged with being rebuffed that he flew out of his car and just started wailing on Dusty once he'd made his presence known. It had also come out in trial number 2 that Dusty was legally intoxicated and had also been smoking weed, which may or may not have fueled his reaction, but I think we can agree that it was a little overboard. And it's possible that Dusty may have overreacted even if he wasn't intoxicated. It's hard to say. We didn't know him. We didn't know his behaviors. But the jury had the right to know and decide for themselves whether or not his intoxication played a factor. Often in cases like this, it does. Alcohol and drugs are usually taken into consideration, and at the time, marijuana was illegal in California. And like most of the details in this case, you are left to decide what you believe is most likely what happened between Dusty and David. I don't care for the evasiveness of David Gensler in the beginning. The hiding out, the hiding of evidence, hiding his car. I don't think he did himself any favors. But if I'm being honest, I just think he was scared. He eventually found out that the man that he stabbed died. So he knew he had to turn himself in, but he wasn't going to just hand over all of this evidence without an attorney and careful consideration. He could have destroyed the evidence, which if he had, I bet he'd still be sitting in prison today. But nothing he did compares to the manner in which the prosecution conducted itself in this case by encouraging perjury and hiding evidence. And I honestly don't know why it was so important for them to secure a murder conviction, and they did so by any means necessary, when regardless of who said what that night, all it really amounted to was a street fight. Scott Davis, who should have minded his own business, he got involved, making matters worse for David Gensler, who was growing more concerned for his own safety, and unfortunately for Dusty, he just happened to be carrying a knife in his pocket, which many people do and are absolutely within their rights to do so for reasons just like this. Whether or not David was justified in killing Dusty really depends on the minutia of the moment, which we can only speculate as it seems to have happened so fast, and how the self-defense laws apply to that is hard to measure. To me, it sounds like self-defense. But at the same time, you have to consider how the police handled things. I mean, look at the death of Charles Vallow in Arizona. The dead husband of cult mom Lori Vallow. He was shot by her brother. And when police were called and her brother was like, "Oh, self-defense," and the police were like, "Okay, cool, have a nice day." The San Diego police and the prosecutor really wanted David Gensler to be made a murderer, and I don't know why. Political reasons, job ascension, who knows? And unfortunately, the truth of that night got lost in the attempts to turn Dusty's death into a murder. David, at best, was trying to be a nice guy. At worst, made a poor judgment call. As for Dusty, his death is sad and senseless. But making David Gensler out to be a crazed murderer certainly doesn't lessen that fact. There's lots of victim blaming going on in many of the comments that I read in this article on this case, but I'm going to stop short of doing that here to Dusty. But friends and family who drag David publicly and in the media aren't right either. In a way, both men are victims here. While Dusty did lose the most, David lost a lot too, when I don't believe he really deserved to. And that, dreamers, is the end of episode 162. Please come over to the Facebook discussion group if you haven't done so yet and request to join. It's there we discuss the cases we cover. We share our thoughts and opinions not only about our show, but any other podcasts that you listen to and documentaries that you've watched, books that you've read, and other news stories, posts about your pets, funny memes. Please come over and share. You can also go over to the show's Facebook page and like that page and leave a review and recommendation. You can also follow us on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and on Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. And right now, I'd also like to take the time to thank Nate B. for recommending the Dusty Harless case to me. He's in our group, very active. He posts a lot of news articles about crime, and he has a very deep interest in many of these stories. He's recommended plenty of them to me, so trying to take them one at a time here. So thank you, Nate. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, a podcast production company on a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to with an amazing roster of shows, including content that involves true crime, history, sports, entertainment, gaming, and social media. So visit our website at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You will find links to all of our podcasts as well as a direct link to our merchandise store and TeePublic. Again, that's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. And for all of you waiting for the Patreon episode, it is up next. It's almost finished. I'm about to start recording it. So hang on, it's coming, I promise. Thank you again so much for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne. Until next time, sweet dreams.